There's a story the old monks used to tell, passed down not in books, but in the hush of evening when the world softened and the mind felt most alive. A traveler once found himself lost deep in a vast forest. The sun was slipping below the horizon, and every path before him seemed to twist and vanish into shadow. He carried a map, yes, a detailed one. But under the dense canopy, landmarks became ghosts. Rivers veered where they shouldn't. Trees whispered unfamiliar songs. The map no longer made sense. In that moment, the traveler realized something crucial. When the visible signs fail, you must turn to an invisible compass. That's what this life feels like, doesn't it? We follow plans, we chase goals, we cling to certainties, education, relationships, careers, even our health. But there comes a nightfall, sometimes sudden, sometimes slow, when all the markers we trusted blur. A loss, a betrayal, a diagnosis, or maybe just an emptiness we can't name. And in that unsettling quiet, the question arises, how do I move through this world when nothing feels certain? Buddhism doesn't offer easy answers. It doesn't hand you a rule book promising guaranteed happiness or permanent peace. What it offers instead is far more precious, a way to walk, not with certainty, but with two steady companions, faith and wisdom. But let's be clear. When we say faith here, we're not speaking of blind belief. It isn't clinging to dogma or forcing yourself to swallow ideas that don't sit right in your gut. In the Buddhist sense, faith is confidence born from experience. It's that quiet, stubborn trust that something deeper than your present confusion is at work, that there's a way through, even if you can't yet see it. And wisdom, it's not about piling up facts or winning arguments about karma or consciousness. It's about seeing clearly, not through the haze of assumptions or inherited fears, but seeing life as it actually is, changing, fragile, interconnected, and infinitely precious because of it. Together, these two, faith and wisdom, form an inner compass, invisible to the eye but unmistakable to the heart. You might ask, why do we need both? Wouldn't one be enough? The answer lies in the nature of this path we're walking. Life isn't a straight road. It's a winding, often treacherous trail through unknown lands. Faith gives us the courage to step forward when our sight fails us. Wisdom ensures we don't stumble blindly. Faith is the warmth in your chest when, after a night of despair, you still rise with the sun. Wisdom is the gentle voice that reminds you the darkness wasn't permanent. And here's the thing, neither arrives fully formed. We're not born with perfect clarity or unshakable trust. We cultivate them. Like a gardener tending both the roots and the blooms, we learn to nourish faith when we feel small and lean on wisdom when we feel bold. Modern life, with its constant noise and shimmering distractions, makes this difficult. We live in an age where answers are a Google search away and uncertainty is treated like a flaw. Doubt is something to be numbed, not explored. But Buddhism invites us to pause, to notice the disquiet beneath the conveniences, the longing beneath the accomplishments. It asks us to turn inward, not as an escape, but as an act of courage. Because only within the stillness of your own heart will you sense that invisible compass begin to turn. And you'll realize you've been carrying it all along. Consider this. Every time you've sat beside someone grieving and offered silence instead of easy words. Every time you felt a moment of awe beneath a night sky or watching a child sleep. Every time you've chosen kindness when no one was watching. That was wisdom. That was faith. Not in a God overhead or a promise of reward, but in the quiet knowing that there's something worthy and beautiful about choosing to walk through this life awake. And so, the journey begins. Not toward some faraway mountaintop or a flawless version of yourself, but into the very heart of your experience, the joy and the sorrow, the clarity and the confusion. You're not asked to believe anything right away, only to notice. To begin watching the way things arise and fade, to see how clinging sharpens pain and how letting go softens it, to feel how, even in suffering, there's something unbroken inside you, and this noticing is no small thing. It's the first step toward wisdom. As for faith, It grows in the spaces between insights, in the gentle patience you offer yourself when understanding doesn't come immediately, in the way you keep returning to the breath or to the simple act of being present even when your mind protests. It's not dramatic, it doesn't announce itself, but one day you'll notice the path feels less threatening. The unknown becomes an invitation rather than a threat. You'll see that you're not wandering, you're exploring. And in that realization, a soft but undeniable joy rises. Not the brittle kind that depends on things going your way, but a joy rooted in being fully alive, in trusting the unfolding, in seeing with clarity and walking with heart. Somewhere ahead, this path will wind toward deeper understanding, toward insights we can't yet imagine. But for now, it's enough to have found the invisible compass and to know that it will lead us one step at a time. And so, we walk on. Somewhere along this journey, you'll realize the most important things in life are the ones you cannot see. You can't see love, yet you feel it shape your every joy and sorrow. You can't see time, yet it leaves its fingerprints on every face you've known. And you can't see the future, yet you build your life upon it every single day. It's in this unseen world that Buddhist faith quietly resides. But let's be careful here. The word faith carries heavy baggage in modern ears. It's often mistaken for naive optimism, or worse, blind obedience to things we're told not to question. In Buddhism, faith is something else entirely. It is not faith in miracles, not faith in the supernatural, not faith in wishful thinking. It's a deep, almost instinctive trust in the unfolding nature of reality. A trust that everything, every joy, every loss, every breath arises according to causes and conditions. That nothing appears without reason, and nothing lasts without change. It's the understanding that even though you can't always see the next step, the path itself is trustworthy. There's an old teaching about a person crossing a vast river on a foggy morning. The water ahead is hidden in mist. Rocks are submerged. The far shore is nowhere in sight. But the traveler moves forward, one stone at a time, each step appearing only after the next is taken. That is Buddhist faith. It isn't about believing the river will disappear or that a bridge will magically appear. It's about knowing in your bones that the stepping stones have always been there, and you will find them when you need them. You don't need to see the whole map. You don't need to predict how everything will unfold. You need only enough faith to take the next step. This is not passive faith. It's an active, intimate relationship with your own experience. When the Buddha spoke of saddha, the Pali word for faith, he didn't describe it as something you either had or didn't. He spoke of it as a living, breathing quality you cultivate through practice. It begins as a small spark, perhaps lit by a word, a teacher, a moment of inexplicable peace. And over time, through reflection, through seeing what works and what doesn't in your own life, it grows into a steady flame. What's beautiful about this kind of faith is that it asks nothing from you but honesty. You don't have to pretend. You don't have to suppress your doubts. In fact, Buddhism encourages doubt, not the corrosive kind that keeps you stagnant, but the healthy, courageous doubt that questions, tests, and seeks to understand. Faith isn't a finish line. It's a companion. It's what steadies your hand when you light a candle for someone you've lost. It's what draws you back to your cushion when your heart feels heavy and restless. It's what whispers to you in the darkest hours, keep going. The unseen path of life often feels like walking through a forest at night. The branches catch your hair, the roots trip your feet, sounds rise in the distance you can't explain. But then, a clearing, a moment of stillness, a glimpse of starlight between the trees, and you realize, even when you couldn't see the way, the path was carrying you. Buddhist faith teaches us to trust in this unseen movement of things, to know that suffering, while real, is not without purpose, to understand that our deepest wounds are not the end of our story. There's a quiet kind of strength that grows when you stop needing every moment to explain itself. You no longer demand the universe account for every disappointment. You no longer insist that life follow your plans. You learn to stand where you are with sorrow, with joy, with confusion, and say, "I will walk from here." And that too is faith. It isn't about agreeing with every doctrine or reciting every scripture. It's about daring to believe that somewhere in the endless turning of birth and death, loss and renewal, there is meaning. Not the packaged, easy meaning we crave when we're hurting, but a deeper, more spacious kind. The kind that doesn't erase your pain but holds it tenderly within the wider embrace of impermanence. Faith says, this suffering is not all you are. This joy is not all you are. This moment, whether light or dark, is only a single thread in the vast, intricate fabric of your being. And when you begin to sense that fabric, when you feel yourself not as a separate, stranded self, but as part of a great, unfolding pattern, that is when faith transforms. It becomes not a belief, but a way of seeing. A trust that the path will rise to meet your feet, even if you cannot yet see it. That the heart can hold more than you thought possible. That wisdom lives quietly beneath the surface of your ordinary days. And so you walk on, not to escape uncertainty, but to enter it. Not to demand guarantees, but to touch the raw, trembling beauty of being alive. The unseen path isn't somewhere else. It's right here, in this breath, in this quiet act of listening, in this fragile, perfect moment you are inhabiting now. And without realizing it, in trusting this, you have already begun. If faith is the courage to walk into the unknown, then wisdom is the lantern you carry in your hand. It doesn't flood the whole world with blinding light. It doesn't erase every shadow, but it shines just enough to see the truth of where you are and what lies before you. In Buddhist thought, wisdom isn't something you collect like coins in a jar. It's not facts. It's not clever arguments. And it isn't a prize waiting at the end of your practice. Wisdom is an experience, a direct, unfiltered seeing of things as they truly are. And what is it we're meant to see? That nothing lasts. That everything we cling to, every face, every moment, every feeling is in constant, quiet motion. That suffering doesn't come from life being difficult, but from our refusal to let it be what it is. There's an ancient image in the Buddhist texts of a person walking through a dark forest at night. Without light, they mistake a rope for a snake, or a tree stump for a lurking beast. They react with fear, with panic, with stories spun in their own mind. But then someone hands them a lamp, and in that soft glow, what was imagined fades. The rope is just a rope. The tree stump is harmless. The darkness remains, but it is no longer terrifying. That lamp is wisdom. It doesn't change the forest. It changes how you see it. In life, we do this endlessly, mistaking our fleeting thoughts for permanent truths. We confuse temporary emotions for the nature of reality itself. A passing sadness convinces us we are doomed. A sharp word from someone else makes us believe we are unworthy. A small failure feels like the story of our whole existence. But wisdom whispers differently. It teaches you to pause, to question the stories your mind tells in its frightened moments, to remember that everything you experience is like a cloud passing through an open sky, beautiful, terrible, or dull, but never staying. And with each moment of clear seeing, something inside you softens. Wisdom isn't cold. It isn't detached. It isn't some distant intellectual exercise. True wisdom has a warmth to it, a compassion, a tenderness for the fragile, fleeting nature of things. Because when you see clearly how temporary every joy and sorrow truly is, your heart naturally begins to let go of its desperate clinging. And in that letting go, peace. Imagine standing on a beach as the tide rolls in and out. You don't try to hold the waves. You don't demand the sea stay still. You simply watch its endless, patient motion. This is how wisdom teaches us to hold our lives. Not grasping, not resisting, just witnessing with deep, steady presence. And here's the secret. When you stop trying to control the world, you finally begin to understand it. You see how joy is born from 1,000 invisible causes. How pain, too, has its roots, not to punish you, but as part of this vast, interconnected web you're woven into. You realize your fears are not unique. Your heartbreak is not proof of failure. Every living thing has known sorrow. Every soul has carried grief. And in that shared tenderness, wisdom gently unites us all. The ancient masters spoke of wisdom as a flame passed from one candle to the next, a single spark illuminating countless hearts without ever losing its own glow. And this is what makes wisdom truly viral, not in the fleeting sense of modern trends, but in the timeless way one honest, clear moment in a person's life can light the path for another. A father calming his child's restless worry, a teacher offering kindness to a struggling student, a stranger meeting your eyes with quiet understanding in a moment of pain. These are wisdom's small, sacred acts. And the more you learn to recognize them, the more you'll discover it everywhere. In the stillness between breaths, in the resilience of a flower growing through cracked stone, in the gentle way morning sunlight softens a room filled with yesterday's sorrow. The flame you carry within may be small, but it was never meant to light the entire world at once. It was meant to show you the next honest step, to help you see the truth without needing it to be any different than it is. And in that clear, fearless seeing, the world changes, not because it becomes perfect, but because you no longer demand perfection from it. Wisdom invites you to become intimate with the mystery of things, to sit beside your own uncertainty and realize it isn't your enemy. It's a doorway. And as your faith and wisdom deepen, you no longer fear the dark stretches of your path. You understand now that darkness is not the absence of light. It's the canvas upon which light becomes visible. And so, the flame you carry remains steady, not to banish the night, but to make it beautiful. There's a moment after the light of wisdom touches you when you realize this path was never meant to be walked by logic alone, and it was never meant to be followed on blind belief either. It's a dance, a quiet, sacred movement between two ancient companions, faith and wisdom, one stepping forward when the other falters, one holding steady when the other trembles. The Buddha himself never asked his followers to believe without question. In fact, he warned them against it. Do not believe a thing simply because you've heard it, he said, or because it has been handed down for generations. Test it for yourself, experience it. And if you find it leads to peace, to kindness, to clarity, then, and only then, hold it as true. But even as he encouraged inquiry, the Buddha knew something else. Without faith, the courage to step into the unknown would die in its cradle. And without wisdom, faith would become a prison of superstition. So the two rise and fall together, like the inhale and exhale of a single breath. Faith is what urges you forward when the road is dark, when the mind is restless and the heart is weary. It's the soft voice that says, keep going, there's something more. And wisdom is what clarifies where you place your next step. It shows you the pitfalls, the illusions, the traps your own desire and fear build before you. Without wisdom, faith can turn reckless, clinging to false promises, chasing empty rituals, mistaking comfort for truth. Without faith, wisdom becomes brittle, a cold, detached observation that lacks compassion and heart. But when they move together, something beautiful happens. The faith to begin, the wisdom to reflect, the faith to continue, the wisdom to adjust. It's no longer a linear path. It's a rhythm, like the ocean's tide, rising, falling, rising again, like the seasons blooming, withering, blooming again. There are days when you'll feel certain as though you can see for miles. And there will be days when the mist surrounds you so completely, you can't remember why you ever started. On those days, wisdom reminds you of the truth you glimpsed in clear moments. And faith holds your hand when even that memory feels distant. This is the nature of spiritual life. It isn't a straight climb to enlightenment. It's a winding road with detours and stumbles and nights where you forget your own name. And it's meant to be that way, because every time faith falters, wisdom grows sharper. Every time wisdom hardens, faith softens it. Imagine walking through a vast, silent forest. You carry a small lamp, that's your wisdom. And you hold in your heart the knowing that somewhere ahead lies a place of rest. Though you can't see it yet, that's your faith. When the wind blows your lamp low, faith keeps your feet moving. When the path grows tangled and strange, wisdom helps you choose where to place them. Neither is meant to exist alone. And you'll notice, over time, as your steps grow more natural, you stop worrying about which one is leading. The dance becomes effortless, a wordless conversation between trust and clarity, between courage and discernment. The great Zen teacher Dogen spoke of this relationship when he said, "To study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. And to forget the self is to be awakened by all things." It's not about building faith so high it becomes blind, or sharpening wisdom so finely it cuts away the heart. It's about their constant living exchange. You trust, you question, you leap, you reflect, you surrender, you observe. Again and again this dance, and slowly it carries you deeper, to a place beyond mere belief, beyond clever words, beyond even the need for certainty, to a quiet understanding that it was never about arriving at a final answer. It was always about awakening to the sacredness of walking itself. Each step, an act of faith. Each glance inward, an act of wisdom. And so it goes, like water meeting stone, like dusk meeting dawn. A dance as ancient as the stars, and as intimate as your next breath. The great challenge of any spiritual path isn't found in temples or meditation halls. It's here, in the quiet, ordinary moments of life, in the sound of your alarm before sunrise, in the face of a stranger who cuts in front of you at the market, in the ache of disappointment when things don't go the way you planned. It's easy to speak of faith and wisdom while surrounded by incense and silence. But the real practice begins the moment you step back into the world. And here's the secret most people overlook. Every moment offers you the chance to embody the sacred, not just the dramatic ones, not just when you're seeking answers to deep questions, but in the way you sip your morning tea, in the way you listen when someone speaks, in the way you meet uncertainty without collapsing into fear. Faith and wisdom are not abstract ideals. They're tools for living, not something you leave on the altar, but something you carry into traffic, into conflict, into loneliness. Let's talk about faith first, not blind belief in rituals or symbols, but the quiet, steady trust in the basic goodness of this moment, however imperfect it seems. It's believing that no matter how tangled your thoughts, how broken your heart, there's something in you that remains unshaken, a stillness you can return to. It's the faith that even when you don't understand why something is happening, there's a deeper unfolding at work, and that you have the capacity to meet it with grace. And then, wisdom. Not the kind you find in books alone, but the wisdom born of paying attention, watching your mind when it clings, noticing how you speak when you're afraid, observing how quickly you judge and how much peace you lose because of it. It's wisdom that comes from asking yourself simple questions. Is this thought helping or harming? Is this reaction coming from fear or from clarity? Am I adding to the noise of the world or bringing a little more calm into it? In this way, faith and wisdom become daily companions, not grand declarations, but small, conscious acts. When you feel anger rising, that's a moment for wisdom. To see it, name it, and choose whether to feed it or let it pass. When you feel despair settling in, that's a moment for faith. To remember that no state of mind is final and no night lasts forever. Even mundane tasks can become sacred when approached this way. Washing dishes isn't a chore. It's an act of mindfulness, a practice in presence. Waiting in line isn't a frustration. It's a chance to observe your restlessness and soften around it. A conversation isn't just exchanging words. It's an opportunity to listen deeply, to recognize the Buddha nature in another being's voice. This is how faith and wisdom move through your days, not in grand pronouncements, but in the way you respond to what life hands you. And it's important to remember you won't do it perfectly. You'll forget, you'll react, you'll fall into old habits. And when you do, faith reminds you that it's okay. That awakening isn't about never stumbling. It's about noticing when you do and choosing to get up again. Wisdom will show you how. Faith will give you the courage to try. The Buddha once said, "Just as a solid rock is not shaken by the wind, so the wise are not moved by praise or blame." But you don't become that solid rock overnight. You become it by showing up, by sitting with yourself on difficult days, by choosing kindness when it's easier to be sharp, by trusting in the goodness of this moment, even when it arrives dressed as difficulty. And slowly, almost without noticing, the gap between the person you think you should be and the person you actually are begins to close. You start to move through your days a little lighter. Your laughter comes easier. Your heart opens more often because you realize it was never about transcending life. It was about learning how to be fully alive within it. This is the practice. Not escaping the world, but walking through it with your eyes open, your heart steady, and your steps guided by the twin forces of faith and wisdom. And in those ordinary moments, you'll discover something extraordinary, that every act, however small, is a thread in the tapestry of awakening, that every time you choose clarity over reaction, trust over fear, compassion over judgment, you're not just living well, you're living free. It begins in the smallest, quietest of moments, a breath held too long, a glance that softens instead of hardens, a thought that rises and is gently let go. No trumpets, no miracles, no lights splitting the sky. And yet everything begins to shift. This is how transformation truly happens, not in a sudden blaze, but in steady, patient sparks. And it is faith and wisdom that strike those sparks. You see, faith is what lets you believe in the unseen possibilities within yourself, not because someone else says you should, but because you've caught glimpses of it in those brief, wordless moments when the world falls away and you sense something vast and tender holding you from within. Faith gives you the courage to step into the unknown, to trust in a deeper unfolding, even when logic, reason, and experience scream otherwise. But faith alone is not enough. Without wisdom, faith can drift into fantasy. It can make us cling to comforting illusions, mistaking hope for truth. Wisdom is the lamp you carry through the dark places faith asks you to enter. It's the steady, discerning light that helps you see what is real, what is useful, and what needs to be released. And when the two move together, something incredible happens. Faith gives you the strength to let go of who you were. Wisdom reveals who you've always been. Transformation is never about becoming someone else. It's about stripping away everything that isn't you. The stories you've told yourself about being not enough, the fears inherited from others, the identities you clung to for safety. All these begin to loosen their grip. And as they fall away, you don't feel smaller. You feel more whole, because what remains isn't a void. It's a quiet, steady presence, a clarity that doesn't need to announce itself, a warmth that doesn't need validation. You start to notice it in simple things. The way your mind no longer chases every irritation, the way your heart softens at a stranger's smile, the way suffering still comes but no longer breaks you. And here's the beautiful paradox. As you become more rooted in yourself, you realize you were never separate to begin with, that the peace you sought outside was always inside, that the wisdom you admired in others was sleeping in you. That faith wasn't about believing in gods or promises, but in the goodness and resilience of your own awakened heart. And this is where the true power lies. Because when you transform the way you relate to yourself, you inevitably transform the world around you. You meet conflict with steadiness. You approach uncertainty with curiosity. You offer kindness not because it's expected, but because it overflows naturally. People feel it even if they can't name it, a calm in your presence, a quiet integrity in your words, a warmth in your eyes that says, "I see you, and it's okay." And without trying to convert or convince, you become a refuge, a reminder that it's possible to live in this noisy, chaotic, unpredictable world and still carry peace inside. This is the ripple effect of a heart shaped by faith and wisdom. It reaches your relationships, your work, your community. It teaches you how to love without clinging, how to forgive without forgetting, how to grieve without drowning. You begin to see every experience, joyful or painful, as part of a larger, sacred unfolding. And even when life breaks your heart, you'll recognize that it breaks open, not apart. that inside every ending is a beginning, that behind every loss is a chance to rediscover what cannot be taken from you. And so, step by step, you change. Not into a saint, not into some flawless, enlightened figure, but into someone real, someone grounded, someone free. This is the quiet, unstoppable power of faith and wisdom. It doesn't promise a life without suffering, but it promises a life where suffering becomes a teacher, not a tyrant. A life where peace isn't something you chase, it's something you become. And in that becoming, you offer the world something rare, not perfection, but presence. Not answers, but attention, not certainty, but love. And perhaps that's all the world truly needs. And so we arrive here, at the place we never truly left, at the home we spent our lives searching for, only to discover it's been quietly waiting inside us all along. The heart. Not the heart that breaks for every passing sorrow. Not the restless heart chasing after one pleasure and fleeing the next discomfort, but the ancient, steady heart, the one that remembers, the one that watches, the one that knows. All this time you thought the path was out there. A better place, a wiser teacher, a perfect teaching, a new version of yourself. But it was here, in your breath, in the ache of your longing, in the way you quietly rise each time life leaves you on your knees. This, dear listener, is what faith and wisdom have been gently leading you back to. Not a destination, but a return. A homecoming to the raw, tender, unguarded self you abandoned somewhere between trying to be enough and trying not to break. And isn't that the quiet brilliance of the Dharma? It doesn't demand you become someone else. It strips away everything you're not so you can remember who you are. A field of awareness, a current of compassion, a flickering, indestructible light. And perhaps now you realize, the journey was never about collecting answers. It was about growing brave enough to live inside the questions. About understanding that clarity isn't the absence of uncertainty, it's the willingness to stay present in its midst. About realizing that your pain is not a punishment, it's a passage. That your joy is not a prize for good behavior, it's your birthright. And so you live, not perfectly, not always wisely, but more awake than before. You laugh deeper. You hurt cleaner, you forgive sooner. And you start noticing those small, quiet miracles, a kindness offered without reason, a moment of stillness amidst noise, a sunrise you almost missed. And you see, this is the path. Not grand, not dramatic, but real. And in every step you carry faith like a steady pulse beneath your skin, not a shield but a companion. And wisdom like a lantern, not to banish all darkness, but to help you see the beauty within it. You stop seeking a life without sorrow. Instead, you learn to hold sorrow with tenderness. You stop chasing peace as a destination, and discover peace is a way of moving through the world. This is what it means to live with faith and wisdom. Not to escape life's messiness, but to meet it fully, to dance with its contradictions, to bow to its uncertainties, and to trust that even when the path disappears beneath your feet, your heart remembers the way, because you were never truly lost. You were only learning how to come home, and now you have. Welcome back.